Well, we're ready to begin round 3. We'll do chapter 10 and chapter 11 for our last test, test 3, and then you will get ready for a final. So in 10.1, we're talking about radicals, and you want to remember this is AKA. I don't know what AKA, also known as square roots. When I have 3 squared, that exponent tells me to take that 3 and multiply it times itself twice. I can back out of that when I look at the square root of 9. And so when I'm looking at this, I want to think about the doubles. I also want to remember that when I have this radical sign, that's what this little deal is, that if there's not a number in this position, then it is the square. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and write the 2, just so we remember we're looking at a 2, the square. And so we're talking about doubles, because we will look at other roots. So when I'm looking at 9, and if I broke it down into its factors, I would have 2 3s. And remember, there's a 2 here. So when we want to simplify, we look at what's inside and this number. So I've got a 2 here. So that means I need 2 numbers that are the same. And what they'll do is they will come out of the radical as 1 number. So to simplify this, the square root of 9 is going to equal 3, which makes sense when we think about over here. How did we get to the 9 to begin with? We multiplied 2 3s. And so when we back out of it, when we have the square root of 9, then our answer will be 3. So let's look at, if we have, 10 squared, that means 10 times 10, which is 100. And then we will have the square root of 100 can be simplified to 10 times 10. And I've got 2 of these. And remember, this is a 2. And so I simplify this back to a 10. Let's look at another example. We'll start with the square root of 69, and we want to simplify it. So when we're looking at these, you're going to have to think back on your doubles. You might even want to make a list of your squares. And you might want to go ahead and get one of your cubes so that you can become familiar with the basic ones. And you can get this off the internet. Just print it or write a few of them. You don't need a bunch. I would say at least up to 20. So when I look at 169, I know that when I break it down, that is 13 times 13. And I have 2 of those. And remember, this is a 2, so this comes out as 113. If I had the cube root of, let's say, 8, and when I go to break it down, 8 is 2 times 2 times 2. And again, we're focusing on this number. So there's 3. And then I find 3 here. And so when I have 3 inside and I have a 3 here, then I take that out. I simplify it as 2. And to check that, you're looking at, let's go ahead and write this, and let me do, to check, you're looking at this and this 3. 2 cubed would give us the 8 that we started with. Okay? What if we have the square root, we're going to leave that square, of a negative number. Now remember, to simplify this, I would multiply. And so we know that 25 is 5 times 5, but I've got that negative in there. If I put a negative with both of those, because they have to be exactly the same, you know, up here they're all the same kind of 2's to simplify as 1 2. They have to be the same, but this gives me a positive 25 and this gives me a positive 25. And so at this point, we cannot simplify this. And so our answer here not a real number. Now we will be able to, later, we will be able to come up with a better answer than this. But for now, we're just going to say not a real number. So if we have a radical, that's the 4th root of 625. And when you're looking at the 4th and higher roots, you want to remember that this number is large, but the number to get there is going to be fairly small because we're multiplying it times itself 4 times. So this one, with its 4th root, when I take and break this down, what do you think is going to go here? Well, hopefully you came up with 5. You know, 5 times 5 is 25, times 5 is 125, times 5 is 625. So this very small number, when you multiply it times itself 4 times, gets large very quickly. So you want to keep that in mind while you're working. And here, again, you know, we've got that 4th root, so I've got to have 4 of these to be able to simplify this and say this is equal to 5. You'll do the same thing with fractions. Don't let the fraction scare you. Remember, you're going to break it down just like this, and so if I'm under here, then 4 is 2 times 2, 9 is 3 times 3, and so this simplifies to give me 2/3. We can do the same thing with a decimal number. Now notice this has 4 places, and so you want to think back when you multiply decimals. If I multiply a decimal times a decimal and they're only tenths, then when I go to do this, I'll have 2 places. Well, I need 4 places. So if I have 1 and 1 gives me 2, that means I'm going to have 2 and 2 here. So when we go to break it down to this middle step, it's going to be 03 times 0.03. So 300ths times 300ths is going to give us this 9 10,000ths. And again, when we simplify it, and most decimals are written with a 0 in the front. I typically leave that off just as a way to shorten my work, I guess, as a shortcut. All right, so let's look at something that's a little bit different. Let's do some exponents. So if I take the square root of x to the 8, we've got several things. There's several ways to do this problem. We could take and expand that completely. One, two, three, four, five, six, 7, 8. And then remembering that this is a 2. Those 2 come out, those 2 come out, these 2, and these 2. So this comes out as 1x, this comes out as another, and finally this one simplifies to be 1x. And then when we go to write our answer, we have x 1, 2, 3, 4 times, and so this is x to the 4th. What happens if this is the cube root of x to the 8? So if I do the same thing and expand it, one, two, three, four, 5, 6, 7, 8, and this is a cube, that means 3 come out as 1, and 3 come out as 1, and I've got 2 left over. Well, the leftovers are going to stay inside. So when we go to write our answer, we have x squared. These are the ones that are going to be on the outside of the radical, times the cube root of x, and there's 2 of them, squared. So we couldn't simplify everything out of the radical, but this is simplified. And you want to be careful with your, in MyMathLab, that you are putting this in the exponent place. And you don't want to forget about your radical sign. Well, I'm wondering if there's a shortcut for this. So let me go back up for a minute and let's look at these 2 and their answers. So if this is square root of x to the 8, I got x to the 4. Cube root of x to the 8, I get x squared, but then I still have an x squared inside. So do you see a shortcut? Well, here it is. What we're doing is we're going to divide. So when we had the square root of x to the 8, if I take 8 and divide it by the 2, which was the square, I get the 4. And remember, that was my exponent. When I had the cube root of x to the 8, if I divide 8 by 3, I'll get 2 with a remainder of 2. And so the first 2 is what goes on the outside, and the remainder is what goes on the inside. And we don't want to forget to put our little cube there. So if we had this situation where I have the 4th root of x to the 6, let's do it the long way, and then let's check it with our shortcut. So I've got the 4th root, and I have 6 of these, and I really don't need to put the dots in between, because when we have x's next to each other, that means they're being multiplied. I'm going to have 4 come out as 1, so my answer would be x on the outside times the 4th root of x squared. Well, let's use that little shortcut method and see if that follows. So if I take and divide 6 divided by 4, let's do it the long way. 4 goes in here one time, and with a remainder of 2. So this is what is outside, this is what is inside. 1x out, and x squared on the inside. So let's use that shortcut. I want you to try this. Try using the shortcut for the 9th root of x to the 25. And so go ahead and pause so that you can figure out the problem, work it out, and then unpause it. Okay, so I used a little bit of color here to highlight that, the 2 is what's on the outside, the remainder of 7 is what will be on the inside. Well, let me change that color. And this one we have -9, but it's being squared. So we can go ahead and simplify this to be 81. Then I can take the square of that to get my 9. All right, let's do some practice. Okay, so you know the drill. Pause it, and then come back and check your answers. Don't you just love that, how magically everything just pops up? So if you didn't pause it, then this happened immediately. Now we talked about you couldn't take the square root of a negative number, but you can take the cube root of a negative number, because negative 2 times itself 3 times. So negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2 equals negative 8. 9 divided by 3 is 3. 12 divided by 3 is the 4. Here are the negatives on the outside, so we can take the square root of the 10. And the difference between these two is the position of the negative. I can't take the square root of a negative number right now. We will later learn how to handle this situation, but for now we're saying, and it's not a real number, but we'll have a better answer later. Here we have the fourth root. 20 divided by 4 is 5, and 81. 3 times 3 times 3 times 3 is how we get this answer. Okay, so that takes care of 10.1. Good luck with your homework, and if you have questions, email me.